It is difficult to believe that after years of being multiple games behind, the English releases for the Trails series have almost caught up with the Japanese ones. It has only been around 6 months since I got the Platinum in Trails through Daybreak, and here I am again, having earned the Platinum in its sequel. I came away from my time in Daybreak 1 really pleased with the first game in the Calvard arc, enjoying the new cast of characters and getting to see a whole new part of the interconnected world that the games are known for. And I couldn't wait to see what the next part had in store. I also didn't expect it to arrive quite so quickly, but here we are. So, let's take a look and see if this sequel manages to improve on its predecessor and how much work is involved in earning its Platinum trophy. The first thing of note is that not much has changed between Daybreak 1 and 2 in the gameplay department. Combat is still split into two parts, a stripped down real-time mode that lets you do some basic attacks to build an enemy's stun bar, and the much more involved turn-based mode. There have been some small additions though, which is always nice. The first of these is in active combat mode, which now lets you cast quick spells at enemies. These are quite useful for hitting large groups of enemies and building up multiple stun bars at the same time, but they're often expensive to cast, and I found that when I relied on them, I burned through my EP very quickly, leaving me with less for the turn-based battles, which are a little bit harder. This is all well and good, but I would have preferred if they'd made the real-time combat a bit more involved, or at least a little bit harder, as I find it's quite easy to take care of most of the enemies without taking any damage at all, even on the hardest difficulty. But the enemies do become very spongy, especially in the late game, so if you're doing all of your fighting in real-time mode, this does become quite tedious. As before, when the stun bar is filled though in real time, you can switch to turn-based mode and give yourself a nice big advantage, doing a bunch of extra damage and giving yourself turn priority. As expected, turn-based is where the bulk of the game's complexity lies, but again, this is mostly unchanged from Daybreak 1. And somewhat disappointingly, the same strategies that work there work just as effectively here. That isn't to say that there isn't a depth to the combat, with the game offering a lot of versatility in how you can build each character, playing to their strengths. There is a lot of options, but the problem is if you've played Daybreak 1 fairly recently, it does feel like you've been doing the same combat plan for around 200 hours, and it all starts to feel a bit rote. As RPG sequels tend to do, you do lose access to all of the powerful gear and quartz that you had access to from your last adventure, and the game does a good job of spreading out the characters available to you as you cross through the story. So there is an element of having to plan and build with what you have, rather than just constantly adding more to your group. I did enjoy this constraint a lot more than in the first game, admittedly, but by the midpoint where you have access to everyone, it felt like I had already solved the game's combat just by remembering what had worked previously. Make sure you have all of your casters set up to abuse Judgment Feather, and that everyone has a Guardian skill. Cast a shield on your party, get Van to aggro everything, and then evade all their attacks, while your casters spam spells and feathers. Do this ad infinitum, and the game is done. This repetitiveness was not helped by how in the third chapter of the game, there is a long stretch of game that is just cutscenes and fights, with no exploration or other gameplay breaking them up, and the enemies slowly turn into health sponges that do very little damage to me, but take forever to actually kill. This segment is so long that the game is quite self-aware about it and has 3 separate parts where it takes you out of the game to ask if you want to save, because it knows you have no way of getting into your menu, and I was so bored through this segment. Large combat set pieces are supposed to be interesting, meant to wear you down, consume your resources before getting to a climactic endpoint, rewarding you for being conservative and clever, or punishing you for being too reckless. But Daybreak 2 fails to stick the landing on this, and the whole thing just feels like a slog. Even the other new additions to the game, like its large optional dungeon, the Merkengarten, or the return of all the minigames that were conspicuously absent from Daybreak 1, fail to invigorate the experience. There is fishing, and a hacking minigame, and a new card game that you can play, but after you've done them once or twice, they stop being interesting. The Merkin Garten is even worse though, and highlights every single issue I have with actually playing Daybreak 2. This 16 floor dungeon is intended as a level grinding and gear acquisition hub, but it's full of repetitive layouts, mundane objectives and uninspired boss encounters that offer very little incentive to actually do them. The dungeon also offers very little to the narrative, with only the most tenuous link to the main story. The dungeon has no puzzles, no challenge beyond kill 7 enemies on this floor or smash 5 rocks on this floor and get a potion. And by the time I reached the end of it, I was just rushing through each segment, only doing the bare minimum.
Show me what you got, Silverblade!
I love the story that spans the Trails games. It's a crazy story that spans 12 games that are all linked together in one interconnected world. They are anime as hell, full of tropes and cliches, and even the parts that are a bit tired or overdone, like the series' love of children being trained to be incredibly strong assassins by nefarious organisations or cults, I can forgive because I love the world and the story. When that story lacks, though, and becomes uninteresting, it starts to make all the other cracks around it a bit more obvious. Trails through Daybreak 2 has been my least favourite game of the series by a fair margin, and the bulk of this is because of the narrative. It felt like throughout the whole game it wasn't actually adding anything to the story. The first couple of chapters are decent, reintroducing old characters, setting the scene and introducing some important concepts, but the second half of the game really fails to capitalise on this setup. The main villain is underbaked and uninteresting, and the few side antagonists you have just seemed to be there because they needed more bodies to pad the boss fights, and honestly seemed more related to the game's intermission plot than its actual one. The story introduces pretty quickly the concept of time travel, but then does nothing interesting with it, never letting you experiment to figure out the correct path forward, just forcing you on rails to hit dead end after dead end. I'm going to complain about the third chapter again, but all that happens in that chapter is fighting, cutscenes, reach a dead end, go back in time, pick another preset option, and do it again. You don't even get given the chance to avoid the dead ends by making the correct choices early. There is so much wrong with this chapter of the game, and I actually think it's the worst part of any of the games in the series, and it sours literally everything else around it. Time travel is an interesting concept, and I really hope that the next game uses this to do something interesting. But I don't feel like the story needed a 50+ hour game to introduce a fairly simple concept to bash you over the head with 15 times. There are, thankfully, some character development bits for a lot of the side characters in the game, and a few of the main cast do get some nice moments as well, especially in the intermission, which does a lot of work in a short period of time. The Connect events that you can access, although limited and much fewer in number than Daybreak 1, are all lovely to watch to see the characters I liked so much from the first game interact and grow. Aside from this though, it felt like everything else felt so thin and pointless. Like, everything important that happened in this game could probably have been cut down into like a 20-hour DLC, or the prologue of the next game, and it probably would have fit a lot better. Getting the Platinum Trophy is quite straightforward, because Daybreak 2 does keep a lot of the quality of life elements that Daybreak 1 introduced. The standard Trails trophy tropes, try saying that 5 times fast, are all here. You will need to fill the monster book, eat all the food, read all the books, catch every fish, buy every gift, and most of these can be bought from the shops. The game's map will show you when shops have something new to sell, so it is a good idea to keep an eye on them and buy what you can as soon as possible, because many of the areas become inaccessible as you progress through the story. Like in every Trails game, you will need to do every side quest for the trophy all in a day's work. Unlike earlier games in the series, there are no hidden side quests in Daybreak 2, and all of them can be found by paying attention to the green exclamation marks on the map. Again, all of these are missable though if you go too far in the story, but the game does warn you about this most of the time. For the Triple Threat trophy, you will need to achieve a AAA rank for Arkwright Solutions, but the game throws so much bonus SP at you with all the hacking minigames and the Merkengarten and the side quests that you shouldn't miss this while going for everything else. You only need 330 SP out of a possible 370 to get this trophy. While you are doing these side quests, you will often come against scenarios where you have to make a decision, which will add points to the game's LGC alignment system, and you need to max the Law, Grey and Chaos alignments to get the True Neutral trophy. All of these, and a lot more, are covered by the game's in-game achievement book, which you need to complete every non-EX labelled achievement for the trophy Nose to the Grindstone. There are a lot of grindy ones in here, like using Quick Arts 500 times, or using 250 S-crafts, or collecting 100,000 shards, so be aware of these and make a start on them early. You will have to do a second playthrough as well. As you play through the first time, you will only receive enough gifts and connect points to max your bond with most of the characters, but not all of them, and the same applies to your LGC alignment. With this in mind, it's probably easier to save your Nightmare Run playthrough for your second one, as you will be overpowered as hell, and it will be a breeze. After you finish the game the first time, a further 7 levels of the Merkengarten will unlock. You don't need to do these for any trophies, but the last floor does have a small cutscene that may or may not be important later on in the story. But I'm guessing that they will, as Falcom have a bad habit of hiding important lore behind optional bosses. Once all of this is complete, which took me just under 100 hours, you can rest easy having earned the Platinum Trophy, The Long Road to Dawn.
I need to heal up soon.
I was so excited to see the follow-up to Trails Through Daybreak, as it was a game that I had a blast with despite a few flaws. It was a great start to the next arc in a series that I loved, and it introduced a lot of interesting things. Comparatively, Daybreak 2 feels shallow and stretched out, a narrative that is all filler and barely does anything to move the overall story forward, wasting time with an unimportant, irrelevant villain and falling back on tired and repetitive tropes and twists. Even bringing back the plethora of minigames and boring mega dungeon couldn't stop me from feeling disinterested in its aimless plot. This hasn't been enough to kill my interest in the series, not yet, but it is disappointing to see such a huge misstep in a series that I have grown to love. But at least I have a remake of Sky FC to look forward to later this year. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this look at Trails Through Daybreak 2, and please let me know if you've played it and what you think of it in the comments, and until next time, happy hunting.